In this video, I'm going to show you how I make kick drums inside of Native Instruments Massive. Here is an example of the kick drum that we're going to make. First of all, I'm going to create a new software instrument and open Massive in Mono. The first thing I always do when opening Massive is go File, New Sound, because that clears all the settings. Now, the first thing that we need to do is go to Oscillator and turn on Restart via Gate and set the phase of Oscillator 1 to 90. The next step is to go up to the amp and right click on the 4 here under amp mod and select mute. Now come over to Oscillator 1 and find a wavetable that is suitable for kick drums. I find that sine waves work particularly well. However, there are lots of other wavetables that work quite well. I've found that Bender works well, Volga works, Disto, Carbon, and the Groan wavetables also work pretty well. But to begin with, we're just going to use a sine wave. Now, the first step is to modulate the amplitude of Oscillator 1. To do that, go over to LFO 5 and drag and drop it onto the amplitude of Oscillator 1. Then turn it into a performer and load curve. You want to draw in a shape that looks like this, or this, or even this. Now, the reason why I'm negatively modulating the amplitude, because I could alternatively just do this, but the reason why I can't do that, well, I could do that, but the reason I'm not going to do that is because Massive, even when you bring the attack time to 0, there's still a delay between when the sound starts and when it's at its peak volume. You can see that here. This is where the sound starts, and this is it at its loudest volume, and then it sustains that volume until you release the key, and then it dies away. But for a kick drum, and especially in electronic music, you want a really punchy, immediate transient that cuts through the mix. And in order to achieve that, you want the loudest part of your kick drum to be at the very beginning. You don't want there to be any delay at all. So to get around that, you can start the oscillator at its maximum level and bypass envelope 4 by muting it, and then use LFO 5 to negatively or inversely modulate the level so that it starts at its maximum value and then goes to its minimum value, instead of starting at its minimum value, then going to its maximum value, and then going to its minimum value. So I've got my shape like this, and now the kick drum sounds like this. If I turn the rate up, we have something that slightly resembles a kick. I'm going to bring up the master out. Okay, now the next step is to add some pitch modulation to give this give our kick drum more punch and more character and more attack. So to do that, I'm going to negatively modulate the pitch of Oscillator 1. So I've just dragged envelope 1 onto Oscillator 1 and brought it down 64 semitones, and then I'm going to take the attack down to 0, and I'm going to draw in a shape that looks like this. I'm going to bring the attack down, the level of the attack down, a level all the way up, and then I get this kind of weird shape. Now you might think, well, that's weird, because you were probably thinking, oh, I would use a shape that looks like this, right? So the pitch starts here and it goes whoop, and then it goes pew down, but really quickly. So it's like pew, like a laser. But that is not. Once again, I mean, it's the same problem with envelope 4, using envelope 4 to modulate the amplitude of everything. It's not ideal because there is a delay between the start of the sound and the loudest point, and we want the loudest point of the sound to be at the very beginning, no delay. So in order to do that, we're going to do things the other way around. So I'm going to start here, which is the maximum pitch value, and then I'm going to modulate it so it rapidly drops in pitch. So if I bring the decay down, oh, I forgot one thing. You have to bring the pitch of oscillator 1 up 64 semitones, or however many semitones you choose to pitch it down by, to compensate for the change in pitch. So yeah. And I'm going to try to make a typical sounding kick drum that's, has a fundamental frequency between 50 and 100 hertz, because that is where you find most kick drums punching in the mix in an electronic genre. So that's starting to sound like a kick drum. But it's not really close enough. I'm going to bring it up an octave. And now I'm going to use a second envelope, envelope 2, to even further modulate the pitch down another octave and draw in a very similar shape, bring the level of the attack all the way down. And you can use envelope 1 to get more of a transient. And then envelope 2 is kind of acting like you can kind of turn it into like an 808. You know how 808s will gradually pitch down over time if they're sustained. Obviously this is not a sustained kick, but you can make it sustained by bringing out, just turning down the rate rather. But that's not what I want. It's also a bit too low. Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. You can modulate the wavetable position to add harmonics to your kick drum, because at the moment it's sounding really dull, a bit boring, very artificial. So you can use envelope 1 or envelope 2, it's up to you, to modulate the wavetable position of oscillator 1. So at the moment, what envelope 2 is doing is it's causing oscillator 1 to start as a square wave, and then very quickly turn into a sine wave. Because if I just have it on square all the time, you get a very harsh, kind of gritty sound, which doesn't sound like a kick drum. And that doesn't really sound like a kick drum either. That, however, does. Well, not like a real kick drum, but it sounds closer. But there, you can be really creative. Triangle to sine works pretty well, but what I find works really well is either grown 2 or grown 4. Yeah. Grown 2 and grown 4 are very similar. No, bender does work. Sine harmonic can work quite well. So that is the kind of main body of the kick, but most kick drums you'll hear will have a top end, and to get that top end I'm going to use envelope 3 to modulate the amplitude of the noise oscillator. And you can choose, you got lots of noise sounds to choose from. Bright noise works best, tape noise also works, and obviously you want a very, short decay. I personally find that bright noise sounds best if you bring the colour down a bit. And at the moment the kick sounds a bit too sustained for me, so I'm going to turn up the rate a bit. And I'm actually going to swap that for that. Okay, now that's more or less it for oscillators. Now we just move over to the effects, and you can choose any 3 of these. Distortion. I find that distortion works really well for beefing up the sound. I'm going to use Teletube, and you can be creative and modulate the dry wet or the drive using an envelope. So at the start I want it to be really distorted. But I don't want that distortion to hang around, because the trouble is, when it does hang around, you can hear it in the tail and it adds some nasty harmonics. It sounds like this if I just mute that. Yeah, it sounds horrible. So I'm just gonna use it lightly, and you could add some reverb if you wanted to. But I'm not going to. I rarely find that it works. Yeah, it doesn't always sound that great. Okay, now with kick drums again, you can use the built-in EQ inside the Massive and cut the mids out. Boost the lows. And then finally, you could use an insert like sine shaper, parabolic shaper, but very lightly, because otherwise, the purpose of distortion on drums is just its only purpose is to saturate and kind of beef up the sound. It's not really meant to, give it like a really gritty sound, because that's not really that desirable. Okay, so that's more or less it for the synthesis of the drums. Now, the next step is post-processing. I'm going to cut some of the sub-frequencies. And then it sounds quite boxy to me, so I'm going to cut at 200. Use a narrow Q. Yeah. And then I'm going to cut some more of the mids out. And now this is where things get exciting, because the real, like, the punch, the clicky part of the kick is coming from between 2k and 5k, so I'm going to boost there to try to get some more snap out of this kick. Yeah, so you can immediately hear it's more, I like to say it knocks more, like it sounds like someone like knocking on wood. And then finally I'm just going to cut out some of the very high frequencies using a very subtle high pass, just to low pass, sorry, to remove those ear piercing frequencies. Okay, so I'm happy with that. Now I'm going to add a subtle bit of distortion just to saturate the sound, and I'm going to use Logic's built-in overdrive plugin. I'm going to turn the tone up to the max, bring the drive down, and then just slowly add it. The thing about overdrive is you do have to be like careful, because things can very quickly sound kind of over distorted and unpleasant. So just use it lightly. And once you've done that, you then have to EQ it again, because I find that distortion does sometimes add some unwanted sub-frequencies that you have to filter out, but that's not a major problem. Now the next step is compression, so I'm going to bring up the compressor here, and I'm going to use the Studio VCA circuit again, because it's my favourite on drums. Bring the attack and release down to the minimum, the ratio to the max, bring the threshold down. Get it really punching. Now let's compare before and after. That's before processing, after processing. Yeah, sounds kind of softer before processing. After processing, it has much more of a click in the transient. Now I'm mostly happy with that, so I'm going to bounce it in place to convert it to audio. And I'm going to choose this one to resample. Now, a key thing to notice here is that this kick drum does have a lot of punch. It's very clicky. But if you listen to it, you know, you can't hear a lot of sub in it. But we can see some sub, obviously, on the spectrum analyzer, but not really enough for an electronic production. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open Logic's built-in FM synth EFM1, and I'm going to create that, and I'm going to use this to add some sub to the kick. So to do that, I'm going to bring the FM depth down, and bring the FM down. So now we just have a very low subby hit. It's like a whoom. Yeah, it's like you know, it's around 60 hertz. So what I'm just gonna do is I'm gonna use a low pass to get rid of everything I don't want. You know, I only want the sub. Now I'm gonna bounce that in place to get our sub kick. And then I'm going to select a sample to layer underneath our main kick, and gonna put some fades on it. And it is pretty long, so I'm just gonna put a fade on the end. Now, something you have to be careful of is, you know, balancing to these samples. So you might want to just well, first of all, this sub kick is kind of resonating at 54 hertz, so I'm going to cut at 54 hertz. Okay, so now we have an upper kick and like a sub kick. And now I'm going to bounce them both in place to lay them on top of each other. Now I have a pretty complete kick sample. Just one last thing to do to tie it all together is just a light bit of compression to compress the two parts together. So this is just like glue compression, so it doesn't need to be very extreme. And there you have it. So just put a fade on the end and bounce in place. And that is how I make kick drums in Native Instruments Massive.